Those interested in Proto-Indo-European or Indo-European studies in general have been quite blessed this year with a number of eagerly awaited publications finally being released. J.P. Mallory has published the Indo-Europeans Rediscovered, a follow-up work to his landmark 1989 volume In Search of the Indo-Europeans. That earlier work served as an entry point for many readers interested in Indo-European studies, and it seems likely that this book will play a similar role going forward. Additionally, we got Laura Spinney's Proto, which serves as a lightweight introduction to Proto-Indo-European and has generally received favourable reviews. Earlier this year, however, I found myself passing the time reading something completely different, The Little Book of String Theory by Stephen Gubser. It's a fascinating read and in itself serves as a lightweight introduction to string theory, much in the same vein as Spinney's text does for Indo-European. I remember back in the early 90s when I was still quite young, seeing the term string theory mentioned in books at the library. I didn't really understand what it meant, but I remember this sense of feeling awe. Authors wrote about it as if it were the ultimate key that would one day unlock all the unanswered questions we have about physics. And I felt a similar sense of excitement when I first picked up Mallory's In Search of the Indo-Europeans. That same feeling that maybe here with Proto-Indo-European we had an interdisciplinary key that could not only unlock the story of the Indo-European languages, but also teach us about their speakers and the world that they lived in. And perhaps even more, that we could take these insights and apply them elsewhere, to the Uralic or Turkic families, and slowly extract the grand story of our shared human past. However, since its boom in both academia and pop science in the late 80s and early 90s, string theory has, at least according to some, failed to live up to the hype, and it is seen as being nothing more than a collation of fancy mathematics. Others actually go a step further, calling it an outright failure as a field of research because time and time again, string theory has failed to deliver experimental confirmation of its predictions. Despite the apparent lack of progress, string theorists themselves remain dedicated to the cause, arguing we simply don't yet have the technology to demonstrate our predictions. It's not hard to find science communicators on YouTube still defending string theory passionately, but equally it's not hard to find people who are willing to criticise it. But it got me thinking. Indo-European studies, and with that the reconstruction of Proto-Indo-European itself, today are almost taken as matters of fact. We don't really question their existence anymore. Instead, we just remain with steely determination, focused on finally solving the homeland question or reconstructing ever more archaic forms of the proto-language. String theory, on the other hand, even at its height of popularity, had its vocal critics. And that got me wondering, who are the critics of Proto-Indo-European? We know a few, of course. We've even looked at one recently in a previous video, Salvatore De Dolla. A recurring argument shared with the criticisms of string theory is that Indo-Europeanists, for all their hard work, still don't yet have any concrete evidence, just lots of fancy models. But it also has to be said that most of the figures who stand in opposition to Proto-Indo-European fall, and this is very politely put, into the realm of pure pseudoscience. So the question is, are there any bona fide academics out there, people with real credentials, who seriously call into question the validity of the Indo-European enterprise? And if so, what do they have to say? Now, as far as I can tell, there's one author worth looking at. A respected scholar with a solid academic standing to back him up. In 2023, one of his key works critiquing the Indo-European question was finally translated into English. To be honest, I had skimmed through an electronic version of it before and admittedly dismissed it rather quickly. But this year I decided to sit down with the book and with an open mind and actually read it cover to cover to understand what exactly troubles the author about Indo-European studies. So here we are, folks. I'm Learn Hittite, and today we're going to talk about Jean-Paul Demoule's The Indo-Europeans. So before people start reacting in the comments, I just want to say that I know the comparison between string theory and Indo-European studies isn't a fair one. String theory remains on a largely theoretical framework, whereas Indo-European has a ton of evidence behind it. Still, I don't think it hurts to take a look at what a critic of Proto-Indo-European and the Indo-European studies more broadly has to say. They might raise a few good points, point out some gaps in our knowledge, and well, let's be honest, we can all benefit from a few fresh perspectives sometimes. So what do we have here? The book is titled The Indo-Europeans, Archaeology, Language, Race and the Search for the Origins of the West. Jean-Paul Demoule is one of France's most senior and respected archaeologists. This book was published in 2023 by Oxford University Press, and it's actually a translation and a refresh from an older 2014 French text, which I also believe was re-released in 2023 too, with some minor updates. I'm confident that, broadly speaking, the opinion expressed here in this book remains the author's opinion today. And this is backed up by the fact that you can watch recent YouTube content with the author. It's mainly in French, but we can see that his commentary still aligns with what is presented in this book. Some general comments about the book. Well, it's not a lightweight text. It's some 500 odd pages. It's great to see that on each page the author provides clear references so you can easily find the source material that the author is referring to. There's also this fantastic appendix section. It's really thorough and it collates various trees, diagrams, maps, models by people like Mallory, Hegarty and others, some of which I've never seen before. So that was fantastic. The book has an interesting structure because it's divided into 19 chapters and Demoule arranges them kind of like a symphony. There's an overture moving through to first and second movements and concluding with a finale and a second overture. It's a thoughtful way to present what for some people can be quite a dense academic subject. It's well written and I never really felt like I had to push myself to read on. I think the author intends this book to be a kind of skeptic's introduction to Indo-European, and it gets really close to doing that in parts. It's just not too often. I did learn a lot about the foundational period of Indo-European studies that honestly I was just completely unaware of. This book filled in some of those gaps, and because it's so well referenced, any part I had doubts about or just wanted to take a deeper dive into, well, I could go and check out the source material for myself and fill out my own picture. Periodically through the book, Demoule shifts focus to the French version of the Indo-European backstory, which makes sense since it was originally written for a French-speaking audience. And I actually enjoyed that because I've never really heard the Indo-European story told from a distinctly French cultural or academic perspective. Now, it's going to be hard to try and capture the full scope of the arguments in a book of this size in a YouTube video, but nevertheless, I'm going to try. And maybe the first thing I should point out is what you're not going to find in the book. The author doesn't meaningfully engage with ancient DNA research. He acknowledges it and gives a couple of pages that touch on it very briefly, but there's no analysis. In fact, we're promised that analysis in a future book. So I guess for the time being, we're just going to have to wait without. What we do, however, get, according to the blurb, is an overview of the Indo-European academic backstory alongside a devastating challenge to the Indo-European story. Doesn't that sound exciting? In practice, the book keeps circling two themes: far-right politics around the Indo-European backstory and a critique of certain linguistic models, first and foremost, language family tree models. With those two strands in mind, here's how Demoule frames the political side of the Indo-European story. Demoule seems convinced that Indo-European studies has the potential to drag us all back to the grim politics of the 1930s. Racism and the far right are constant themes in the book. He devotes his entire second movement and part of the third, which would give us a total of around 7 chapters, to these concerns. A standout feature of the book is how Demoule bookends his work with 12 theses. At the start, he lays out the official, which is his term, 12 theses of Indo-European studies. These are a kind of caricature of the field as he sees it, and we're meant to journey with him through to the finale where he gives us his 12 antitheses. I'll share both on screen now. Howdy folks, it's me doing the edit. It might be a good idea to pause and screenshot this or something. I couldn't get both the theses and antitheses side by side, so I'll show them one at a time. I didn't want to edit them or anything because they're a big part of what the book is about. Even now though, it's still pretty condensed, so my apologies to those people using smaller screens. Maybe, I don't know, try and use telepathy or something to read them. Anyway, back to the video. We're going to be taking a look at one of these in a little bit of detail. If we compare his official thesis number 11 with its antithesis, you can see how Demoule overtly fears the far-right exploitation of Indo-European studies. And he seems to suggest that there's an ideology baked into the model. Take his repeated references throughout the book to the work of archaeologist Gustav Cassinian. Cassinian, for those who don't know, was a German linguist and archaeologist with some very spicy nationalist takes. He viewed the spread of the Indo-European languages as the result of invasions by vigorous Germanic or Nordic warriors who conquered weaker populations and imposed their languages upon them. Cassinian pinned the Indo-European homeland on Northern Europe, somewhere near the Baltic, a narrative that, unsurprisingly, was an absolute hit in 1930s Germany. His archaeological ideas, however, though did lay the groundwork for a lot of post-1945 research, even if his nationalism was rightly rejected. Demoule labels Indo-European studies as Cassinian. And whilst he acknowledges that Cassinian's far-right ideas only really gained traction, at least on paper, in Germany, he believes this Cassinian view never really went away from Indo-European studies, and that even today Indo-European studies can be boiled down to the simplistic narrative of vigorous Indo-Europeans conquering a weaker majority. A narrative which, according to the author, is sure to be misused by the far right. What the author misses, however, is the complexity and breadth of arguments across Indo-European research. Far from the single Cassinian storyline Demoule tries to present in his work, the actual Indo-European literature describes intricate, complex, multifaceted, region-specific patterns of expansion, and we know Indo-Europeans spread out. The distribution of their languages today proves it. But that spread was varied and unfolded differently across different times and different places. And it was not always successful. There's evidence for a number of Indo-European expansions that failed to persist. Demoule likes to use this term Cassinian to nudge the readers towards suspecting a shady undercurrent in the field. He works hard to entangle Indo-European studies with far-right politics. And after a while, it's not just repetitive, it becomes frustrating because you realise that he's telling only half the story. He's trying to inflate this boogeyman of racism and extremism that he claims haunts the discipline. On page 219, for example, he tries to throw the Journal of Indo-European Studies under the bus. He paints it as a kind of Trojan horse for scientific racism due to its early ties to a controversial figure. The journal was launched in 1973 and was published and funded by Roger Pearson, who had some really far-right connections. And whichever way you cut it, that's not a great look, let's be honest. And some academics, even at the time, boycotted the journal. But context here really matters. As JP Mallory, who sits on the journal's review board, said in a 2017 interview, if Pearson hadn't stepped up to publish it, who would have? Funding in academia is oftentimes very hard to come by, particularly in less glamorous disciplines like linguistics. So at the time, it really was a case of we have to take what we can get. The facts Demoule includes are accurate, but it's his framing that often implies a more sinister continuity than the evidence actually supports. The truth is, the journal, even in its beginnings, was never short of left-leaning editorial contributors. Maria Gimbutas was one of the journal's founders, and I find it incredibly hard to believe that she was some kind of closet fascist. The truth is, I'd be thrilled to get an article published in such a journal because just look at the names on the editorial board over the past few decades. Some very fine linguists, and they're not all Indo-Europeanists, just damn good researchers. Now, Demoule's concern isn't entirely unfounded. The field's history does warrant a degree of vigilance, but at times his treatment of the far right and Indo-European studies, it just veers into paranoia. At every turn he finds a far right spectre or racialist ghost in the narrative of Indo-European, and he treats the field honestly as if it were haunted by them. Linguistics, archaeology and genetics have and probably always will attract more than their fair share of pseudo-nationalist ideas and unsavoury characters. That's unfortunate. We've talked about some examples in linguistics in previous videos, and yeah, we should call people out when we see stuff like this, but none of it actually invalidates the science itself. Indo-European studies, and the studies of other language families for that matter, combine archaeology, genetics, linguistics, through robust methods to give us a deeper insight into prehistory. Which brings us to the trees, or the issue the author has with certain linguistic models in Indo-European studies. I suppose the goal of the author is to strike at what he sees as the most powerful rallying point for his far-right spectres, namely Proto-Indo-European and the associated homeland where it must have been spoken. It's important to note that the author doesn't deny the shared characteristics of the Indo-European languages, nor the fact that they clearly form some kind of family. That in and of itself already sets Demoule apart from some of the more pseudo-scientific critiques of the Indo-European model. However, as the book unfolds, it's clear he's on a crusade to void the very notions of a Proto-Indo-European homeland, people and language. It's his way of exorcising the far-right ghosts that in his eyes are present in the field. In Demoule's first overture, we get the promise of a closer look at the archaeological arguments countering the traditional positions on Indo-European origins, the steppe or the Anatolian homeland, but that moment never actually arrives. Chapter 11, What Archaeology Tells Us Today, gives us around 20 pages surveying early European prehistory, and that's probably the best part of the book. And it leads into a tiny subsequent chapter, literally just a couple of pages, on the Paleolithic continuity theory. For context, the Paleolithic continuity theory argues that the Indo-European languages didn't arrive in Europe through later migrations from the steppe or Anatolia or wherever, but have been spoken here continuously since the Paleolithic. That the first Europeans were, in effect, already Indo-Europeans. It's a fascinating, fringe alternative to the mainstream migration models, and Demoule briefly mentions that this continuity idea has had support from several archaeologists, but never actually explores their arguments in depth. In fact, we get more of a discussion on the linguistic reasoning behind such models than the archaeological ones. My question is, why? It feels like such a missed opportunity. It's one of those moments where the book gestures towards something genuinely interesting and then just abandons it. Time and time again, when I feel the book should be talking about archaeology, because I'll remind you, like, that's the field that the author is trained in, we actually end up talking about linguistics. To understand the story of the past, we need to be drawing on and weaving together evidence from as many fields as possible. Yeah, of course, linguistics is important, I'm going to say that, but so is genetic data. But okay, the author doesn't want to engage with that. Fine, let's go into the archaeological detail. This is the area the author knows most about. What are the arguments? What does the data say? But the author never really does that. Sure, we get some commentary connected to his field, but it's cursory at most. And when he tries to cover linguistics, he just completely misrepresents the models that we use. So generally it's a mess. The language tree model is a particular bone of contention for the author. And throughout the work, the Indo-European tree itself, with Proto-Indo-European positioned neatly at its root, is constantly cast as an inadequate way to represent the relationships among the Indo-European languages. And I guess the author's goal is by questioning that root, that linguistic root, he hopes to ultimately undermine the entire Indo-European question and finally exorcise his ghosts. The problem is that in the book, the Indo-European tree is waved away as problematic again and again without much detail to as of why. We get a single line regarding the branching tree model, and it says that they are unable to accommodate the phenomena of borrowings and convergence. And that's more or less all the commentary we get. Also, there are no examples or explanations given. For something that the author finds so central and brings up so often, it's allotted, amazingly, only a handful of pages, and in those pages there's plenty of meandering along the way. If the tree model is so flawed, why not try and present a worked alternative that explains IE better than what we currently have at the moment? He also rolls out that familiar claim that proto-language reconstructions and trees can't be validated because, by definition, we lack direct evidence. Now that's partly true at great time depths, but we absolutely can test the method at shallower ones, and that's not just in the Indo-European family. It's also worth remembering that a tree isn't a single diagram or dogma, it's a family of methods. Even when this book first appeared in French, there were already multiple ways to build trees, precisely to address known issues in traditional comparative models. Very simply put, tree models are good at capturing three things: shared changes, subgrouping, and the relative chronology of splits. It's as with the reconstruction of Proto-Indo-European itself, models like this don't claim to represent an absolute known reality. They're an interpretation of what we think the situation looked like. And interpretations get refined as new data and techniques arrive. And that's completely normal. The author seems to think that because the models evolve over time and are not static, that this is something bad. But for me, it's actually something very positive. We're always searching for better lenses to view the past. Now, occasionally, and I counted just 5 times in the book, the author hints at alternatives to the tree model. One example is Kroeber's graphic representation of Indo-European. Now, the other references are all to the wave model. Now, Demoule is right that classic trees aren't great at showing borrowing and convergence. It's just one of their weaknesses, whilst wave-style diagrams handle this sort of lateral diffusion better. But there are also hybrid approaches that add side links and edges to trees to account for contact. In practice, historical linguistics uses a variety of models where they're appropriate, such as we do across language families. This isn't just an Indo-European thing. In Uralic, for example, because there's still no broad agreement on the intermediate nodes between Proto-Uralic and the lower branches, scholars therefore often avoid nowadays to committing to a traditional tree model, although you can still find them. In Oceanic, earlier work often favoured wave-style models to represent the language family, but more recent treatments use a cautious top-level tree with subgroupings and linkages, because as our understanding becomes more refined, the tree model becomes more insightful. Demoule briefly cites a 2005 paper on perfect phylogenetic networks. The paper itself is well worth checking out, and while not without its faults, it's a solid example of how linguists actually tried to deal with real-world language contact. Demoule basically gives it no attention though, beyond noting that the model is broadly similar to what's come before and that the proposed contact zones are somewhat surprising, which is exactly what the paper says anyway. He then shrugs the whole thing off, arguing that none of it matters because these models are ultimately unverifiable. Now, any non-linguist reading the book might feel that the author's call to look beyond trees, and presumably that means to look at the wave model, will fix any problems we have with understanding the dispersal and development of the Indo-European languages. But this would be completely misrepresentative. Wave models have existed for almost as long as branching tree models have, precisely because linguists were aware of the limitations of the tree model and sought better alternatives. Demoule has uncovered nothing new here, nor offered any new solutions. The author suggests there's a doublespeak in the Indo-European community, an idea that shows up perhaps most clearly in the contrast between his 12 original theses and his antitheses. He points towards a disconnect between the nuanced arguments that are often presented in academic literature and the more concrete, definitive claims that appear in mainstream representations of the Indo-Europeans. He often notes, disparagingly, that the Indo-Europeans are presented in the media as conquering, invading warriors with little attention given to other factors behind the spread of the Indo-European languages. Demoule also thinks that there's a doublespeak within the community. Here again the argument circles back to trees and proto-languages. He claims that on the surface academics say that their models are imperfect and need refinement and that there's more answers out there and there's more to be learnt, whilst on the other hand accepting them in their entirety. Now, I honestly don't know what to do with that last point, because even a cursory look at the literature shows it isn't true. Sure, some ideas are more widely accepted than others, that's the case in any field, but debate and revision are everywhere in Indo-European. As for the gap between academia and the mainstream, I'd argue that's largely a media-driven issue. Something we probably can expect across any discipline, because how often do we see, supplements touted as the next fat loss miracle based on preliminary studies with tiny patient cohorts? In the mainstream, arguments are typically distilled into simple, engaging narratives to hook readership and to get people to buy stuff. Often, unfortunately at the expense of nuance. If this were the only book you read on the Indo-Europeans, and in the French language market, given the author's reputation, that's entirely possible, you'd come away with a skewed, unhealthy view of the field. You'd be unaware that linguistically, the criticisms of modelling presented here aren't in any way unique to Indo-European. And you'd have no idea about the latest developments concerning ancient DNA and the archaeological discussions because they're barely touched upon. The book also avoids engaging with anything in any real depth or sophistication, beyond perhaps what you'd expect in a regular non-academic bookshop title on the Indo-Europeans. So I can only assume that the target audience for this book is the generally uninformed public, and that makes this book rather disconcerting. Because if you have something of a background in Indo-European studies, maybe you can filter out the author's ideology and just keep the good stuff. But without that background, you're getting a dangerous misrepresentation. Now, I originally decided to take a second look at this book because I noticed the author give a pretty good account of himself in some other content online. Admittedly, now this was discussing another topic, but I thought, yeah, this gentleman has some engaging things to say. So, revisiting this book and seeing as the author is one of Europe's senior archaeologists and that the author promises us a devastating challenge to the Indo-European model, I expected, some interesting archaeological discussion points around Indo-European studies. It did none of that. At least there's no real depth to the archaeological arguments presented. By and large, it's a very poor representation of the state of the field. And upon finishing the book, I felt like I just learnt more about the author's political ideology and the fact that he doesn't quite understand linguistic models more than anything else. Now, it is available to buy online. You can pick it up from the Oxford University Press website. I got this one for about €30, dollars, pounds, something like that. I've been Learn Hittite. Please like, subscribe, hype the video because apparently that's now a thing. You've been fantastic as always. Goodbye for now.